Okay, so this video is intended to show the process for using Stapplet.com, specifically to do two categorical variable and two quantitative variable analysis. Of course, you can see that it has plenty of other things as well. And I encourage you, if you encounter different data sets, to experiment with using these as well. But the first one here, especially for our purposes in this project, would be to look at comparisons between variables so that we can start to make inferences and start to make connections between the presence of one thing and the presence of another, and really start to make work on convincing arguments for courses of action in our projects. So what I have for us to use in this is some data I made up that connects variables. I did one categorical, that is the comparison of food trucks and restaurants staying open over a 5+ year course of time. And then I also have one that compares how many trees are present on a city block, and then how that block's average temperature compares to the city as a whole, right? So that one would be the quantitative, and the first one, the food truck, is our categorical. So if we start with our categorical variables, you'll see that if we go there on Stapplet, it takes us to this, and it defaults to a two-way table, which is what we have. There is also raw data that you can enter as well, and you see that it just has a different format. A lot of categorical variable tends to be presented in two-way tables, so we will go with that. Now, what we are, again, connecting here are explanatory variable, which will be our columns, right, are the new eateries, right, so restaurants versus food trucks. And then our response variable, right, is their operating status. Okay, so we're just labeling our two. Okay, so then if we look, and we can just like copy and paste our labels from the Excel spreadsheet here, right? So we have new food trucks since 2015, that's our first column. And then we have new restaurants, that is our second column. And then notice we have a column for total because we had a two-way table. Stapplet also creates a two-way table for you out of the data, so you don't have to enter a total column. It will get confused then, and then it will add the total column when it creates its own total column. So you want to leave that blank. And then we do want to add a row because we have three operating status measurements, right? We have the still operating now, closed within 2 years, and closed within 5 years, right? So those are the three labels we're going to enter for our rows. So again, you can just copy and paste them over. And this works as well if you have like a PDF that you found of data, you know, anything digital. If you have something in print, then you'll, obviously be typing, but okay. Now we're going to enter the data as we have it, right? So these 6 fields here, we're going to transfer over, okay? And so we have the food trucks, it was 17, 5, and 2. And then the restaurants was 22, 31, and 7. Right? So just getting that transferred over. Give it a quick double check, 17, 5, 2, 22, 31, 7. The last thing you want to do is make a data entry mistake along the way. So check it to make sure that's correct. And now we can do the begin analysis, right? So you hit begin analysis, and it brings up, by default, a segmented bar chart, which is a particularly useful way of looking at the data. So you can see that it has color-coded the categories for us. It tells us what they are on the right here. Okay, and then it tells us what we measured, right? The new eateries, we have new food truck, new restaurant. Then we have the relative frequency of a particular status, right? When the measurements were taken. Down below, you'll see you also have the two-way table that looks very similar, but it also includes percentages for the different categories as well, right? So the segmented bar chart is a particularly valuable way of looking at categorical data because you can see differences between the different categories as they pertain to food trucks and restaurants, respectively. And then you can start to look for connections between the operating status and which type of eatery has been opened, right? Now, there are other ways to look at this as well. So this is one presentation of the data, and Stapplet gives you 3 choices, right? So side by side is another one that you'll commonly see, right? Where you see each one is given its own sort of its own bar, and then they're stacked next to each other. This sometimes might make it a little bit more difficult to compare categories. One nice thing about Stapplet when you're interacting with it in real time is that you can actually hover, right, and then see the descriptions. If you were presenting this to somebody, and if you printed, right, or did a screenshot, you would lose those things. So you'd want to go with the one that was the most visually digestible. So generally speaking, segmented bar is a little bit better than that. And then depending on how detailed you want to get and what case you're trying to make about the data that you have, you might want to also use that other option, which is called a mosaic plot. Now, a mosaic plot you'll see is very similar to a segmented bar chart in that, right, it's got the categories stacked on top of each other to make 100%. What it does that is different is it actually adds a new piece of information. And notice that the bars are now different widths, right? So the new food truck bar is thinner than the new restaurant bar. And what that is taking into account is how many of each there are, right? So if we go back to our original data entry, notice that if we add up the columns here for how many, the food truck column, we will get 20, actually probably easier to look at, we'll get 24, right? So there are 24 food trucks and there are 60 new restaurants, right, in our time frame that we're looking at. So what this does is it creates a wider bar for the one of which there are more observations. And so now we can also start to connect how many of these things exist to their operating status, right, over time. And so that just gives you another way of connecting information and trying to draw connections between things to make your case for whatever it is that you are trying to accomplish. Okay, now additionally, you can also you can export your summary statistics, right? So if you need to take this chart and put it somewhere, you can definitely do that. And so it also allows you the opportunity to take this data and send it elsewhere. Okay, now to look at the categorical data, right, we're going to first go back to Stapplet.com. And so what we'll be doing now is looking at the quantitative variables, right? So you hit quantitative variable and you can see that it pops up, right, the ability to enter our data for the explanatory and the response variables. So if I go to the chart, you can see that our explanatory is the presence of trees on a city block. And our response variable is what is the average temperature on that block as compared to the average temperature of the city. So we entered that one. Okay, now, one thing you can do if you have your data in Excel is you can highlight the cells that you want to transport over, right? So this is going to be our explanatory variable observations. And if we copy that set of cells, when you go to the Stapplet page and you go to the explanatory input, right, where we're asked to put in our observations, notice that when you paste there, it actually separates them by space already, which is one of your options, right? You can separate by space or comma. Okay, and so it does that just by highlighting the cells and copying them over, right? And then that can sometimes work with PDFs too, depending on how the data is presented. And again, if you are entering from something that you have actually printed out, then you would need to do this by hand, and you can use commas or spaces as you see fit. Now, when we go to get the response variables, notice that it tells us to make sure that we keep the individuals in the same order, right? So that means to make sure that we don't copy this incorrectly, right? So make sure you get exactly the same set of data in exactly the same order, which isn't too difficult when you have a table. But depending on how your data is presented, it might be something to keep an eye on. So we'll copy that set, and then we'll paste. Okay. Now this one, because of the formatting of the table, notice that we have a little bit of a spacing issue here. Now that's fine. It will still understand that there's no new data in between these. But if you would like to sort of clean it up, you can start to just remove some of the spaces in there. So you can see based on our formatting, we just had some fairly large spaces, like some tabs or something to that effect. And so if we just kind of go through and clean that up, it makes the data look a little nicer. And it's not necessary, but it does kind of help you look and say, okay, I've got the right number of data, that type of thing. All right, so now we have our explanatory and our response variables. So when we hit begin analysis, it will show us a scatter plot, right? Okay, now with the scatter plot, right, what we have is a comparison of the two values, right? So since these are numerical comparisons, right, quantitative comparisons, the scatter plot is the default because that's what's going to allow us to do things like regression and look at trends and things like that. So what we have is each of these dots represents one of the observations, right? So for example, here we have a block in which there are no trees, and the difference between the temperature on that block and the temperature of the city, on average, is that that block is 4 degrees hotter, right? It has a higher temperature than the average temperature of the city. And you can also see we have this one here where there's one tree on a particular block, and that block has the same average temperature as the city itself. Right, there's another data point here where there are 5 trees on that block, and the average temperature on that block is 2 degrees less than the average temperature of the city. Okay, so what we would do with this, right, is now we can kind of see that there seems to be this kind of trend, right? We can see that these things tend to, as you go to the right, the dots tend to go lower, right? And that suggests that there's some connection between how many trees there are and the average temperature. Okay. So then if you want to look at the R value that is associated with that, right, which tells us sort of like the numerical strength of the correlation, then you can click on calculate correlation, and you can see that as you would expect, right, we have a negative correlation because it's going downward, right, and that R value is fairly strong, right? So -1 being the most correlated that negative trend data can get. This one is actually a pretty strong correlation, that it is -0.847. Okay, meaning there seems to be a strong relationship between the increase of trees on a block and the decrease in the average temperature on the block. Okay, now we can also look for a trend line, right? So if we wanted to make some predictions about if this block has this many trees, we can expect it to have this difference from the average temperature. Then we can calculate the least squares regression line, which will give us, right, the trend line. It also gives us some additional graphs, and we don't really need them for our purposes. So we can close those, and let's just take a look at the scatter plot. So now we have our regression line, which again is sort of used as a predictor. Okay, now if you scroll down, it'll also give you the equation of the regression line, right? So ry equals mx plus b of sorts. It tells you how many data points were used to get it, what the standard deviation is, and the r squared value as well. Okay. All right. Now, this is something again that you would use to present, and you could make a case for planting trees. If you want the average temperature of your city to go down, you can make a case that there seems to be a connection between how many trees there are and what the temperature is in a particular area, right? Okay, so that is quantitative variables. That is the end of those 2 particular methods of presenting data on Stapplet.